Okay, colleagues, so let's continue our little reading exercise. So the basic idea is to look at the study guide and read this carefully. So Marx is a challenging thinker, also for me challenging, so I'm doing this for your sake, but also for my own sake. Anyway, let's start. We'll see how it goes. So chapter 7, Karl Marx, essential reading, right? Notice essential reading are the selections from Kant, which are not at all simple to read. Marx in this sense is highly challenging. Also, I would say rewarding, but still, right? So further reading is Boucher and Kelly, and then we can take the bibliography in Boucher and Kelly to proceed from there, especially books by Alan Wood, for example. Notice there are 2 chapters in Boucher and Kelly. So this is basic stuff everybody should try to familiarize themselves with. Anyway, so many of Karl Marx's works were co-authored with his collaborator Friedrich Engels. Engels played an important role in Marx's life and work, but most experts recognize that Marx was the main intellectual force in his writings. By the way, Boucher and Kelly make a note that Marx is not Engels. And this is sometimes may be a problem, okay? That later thoughts attributable to Engels, not really Marx, maybe even go against the grain of what Marx was saying. Anyway, for simplicity, we'll refer to Marx and Engels as Marx. So Marx is perhaps the most famous or infamous, right? He's praised or blamed for much of the course of the 20th century European history. Notice, I mentioned yesterday that many of his important writings were actually published after the revolution in Russia. So how much can he really be blamed for that as a big question? No, I can tell you. My general approach is to see Russian Revolution completely divorced from the ideas of Marx. Tsarist Russia was in a horrible condition. The revolution happened for its own internal reasons. And you can see in Stalin's repression very much a continuation of the Tsarist repressions. This is my null hypothesis. This is my default, right? It's obviously some nuance to be added to that, but basically, I think if you say that sort of, if you substitute a Soviet Red Star for a Byzantine Tsarist eagle, nothing changes very much. That's my basic idea. So I would propose, methodologically, we forget about the experiences of China and Russia when we talk about the thought of Karl Marx. There's a very nice article by David Woodley, I should read it at some point, that talks about the regimes in Hitler's Germany and in Stalin's Russia in sort of a Marxist analysis as a deployment of state terror to discipline organized labor. Sort of to abolish trade unions, abolish labor rights, and deploy the instruments of state terror in order to force people into work, into labor. So kind of both Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia would be capitalism which relies on state repressive apparatus. So this is my default. This is the default where I'm coming from. Anyway, let me go back to the subject guide. So anyway, so Marx's predictions about the demise of capitalism seem premature. And that's an interesting question because to some extent, definitely yes, but maybe we can see certain ideas of communism already realized in the world today. Again, this is something I mentioned when I was reading Miller's short introduction in Kant on Marx, right? But this notion that if you look at extreme poverty, lack of voting rights, lack of social security, right? So we have gone a long way. We have come a long way as a society from where Marx was in the 19th century. And by the way, some of these changes were directly due to labor struggles. So anyway, let me, although this is not full-fledged communism in any shape, matter, or form, because the 7 billion people are still proletarians, and within Marxist literature, there's always this suspicion towards reformist social democracy. I think rightfully so. The idea is that, okay, workers get concessions, but this does not really translate into a lasting change, right? And we can see, I think, in the world today, especially with our inability to solve global challenges, that we do not seem to be moving towards what Marx thought was the most important about communism, namely human beings taking control of their life instead of being ruled by market forces as by a blind force of nature. And I want to say, even in 2021, we are still largely being ruled by market forces as by a blind force of nature, and not really in control of our history, or so it seems. That's the contention. Anyway. So Even though his predictions about the demise of capitalism seem premature, his analysis of enormous power and potential of capitalism as a global force for change is now accepted by many who would not regard themselves as Marxists. So notice. So Marx is a critic of capitalism, but he is also, very importantly, he is a prophet, I don't want to say promoter, but he is the, well, he emphasizes the important positive role of capitalism, positive role of capitalism. And so you actually have in BSO, Bailey Smith, Owen, you have in BSO, I think Bill Warren, it's a reference of a person who thinks it's too early, still too early, right, still too early for communism, because capitalism has not finished its evolutionary role, right? Is not yet finished with its civilizing mission, right? Anyway, so yeah, and also when we talk about this demise of capitalism seem premature, so maybe already partially in communism, but also we have to understand that Marx himself, especially in later unpublished volumes of Das Kapital, explains why capitalism will not fall, right? So his predictions should be taken with a grain of salt. Are there really predictions, right? Because again, if you read Marx's later works carefully, you see that maybe there's reasons, Marxist reasons, to not expect communism to automatically win in a short period of time, right? Anyway, so how inevitable is communist revolution? That's not clear. Anyway, so Marx's writings can both be highly accessible, and I have to say that the simplicity of Marxist writings is illusory, I would say, right? For example, the Communist Manifesto is easy to read, but it's the first of the later works. But still, Marx has reworked huge chunks of Communist Manifesto, I think, later on. And again, in later prefaces, Marx talks about how there are problems with the Communist Manifesto, especially this notion that the theory of transition needs to be changed. Transition needs to be changed, and I also think that the theory of the state, So this is Marx writing in later prefaces, right, to the Communist Manifesto, that certain things in Communist Manifesto should, in principle, be altered, even though they're still publishing it as a historical document. So, especially we're talking about 1848, the fateful year of the revolutions, and 1871. So almost, actually, more than 20 years have passed, right? So things have changed. Anyway, so by the way, also let me remind you that much of 20th century European history, Marx very explicitly predicts that revolution in Russia is impossible, right? So this is important to keep in mind, because revolution has to begin in a country of advanced capitalism, not in a backward peasant feudal country. This is important. Anyway, so, and like Russia has to first go through a bourgeois revolution. Only then maybe we can have a communist revolution, or at least this is the most straightforward reading of Marx. Anyway, so as always, I remind you that all of these details you should pick up from McClellan. McClellan does an excellent job of laying out all of this stuff I'm talking about here. All of these references to prefaces, later prefaces of Communist Manifesto, etc., etc. Anyway, so Communist Manifesto seems to be difficult. It seems to be easy, but there are other writings which are difficult and technical. So you will need to read them carefully in light of the subject guide, right? That said, they are easier than Hegel's writings. Well, maybe, I don't know. I find probably Marx harder than Hegel, but maybe that's on me. Anyway, in this chapter, we will look at Marx's ideas, especially his analysis and critique of capitalism, and what bearing this has on thinking about the state and politics. So we are talking about Marx as a political philosopher. In doing so, okay, and let's take a moment to look at these 4 areas. So when we think about the questions for the University of London exam, at least these 4 areas we should keep in mind. So first of all, explain whether Marx is offering a moral and political critique of capitalism, an important point, right? Second, explain Marx's theory of historical change. Third, analyze his theory of class struggle. And fourth, describe the role of state and politics in Marx's ideas, especially this last one. Whether Marx even has a role for state and politics, or revolution happens automatically. Well, spoiler alert, it's complicated, right? And so learning outcomes, by the end of this chapter, we need to be able to explain Marx's critique of wage labor, his theory of exploitation, if you want, explain the main features of his theory of historical change. This is basically explain his theory of historical change, and a critique of wage labor, again, is a critique of capitalism, right? Analyze the process of transition, and describe the role of politics and the state in his ideas. Okay. So, Introduction. So Karl Marx, born in Trier, Germany, to an assimilated Jewish family as a student in Berlin, first studied law, then fell under the influence of the dominant Hegelian philosophy. So Hegel died before Marx entered the university. Hegel's influence was carried on through a group of young Hegelian teachers, students, and intellectuals who helped form Marx's own distinctive philosophical method. Among those young students, so the young Hegelians or the left Hegelians, was Friedrich Engels, son of a textile magnate, so clearly a bourgeois himself. Engels, I keep mentioning this, but it's important, right? It's important. The bourgeoisie are not evil, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the bourgeoisie may play some role in transition to communism, right? So Marx actually and Engels, they write about themselves in the Communist Manifesto. They talk about how the sort of the forward, if you want, let's say the forward wing of the bourgeoisie, the progressive wing of the bourgeoisie joins the proletariat. Foreseeing the transition, right, to communism. Anyway, so Engels became a lifelong friend and collaborator, supported Marx. Marx endured poverty. On leaving the university, Marx became a journalist and newspaper editor, and it was through commenting on the living conditions of the working class in the wine industry that he became involved with radical politics in the years leading up to the fateful year of revolutions of 1848. Right, so Marx firsthand saw the appalling living conditions of the working class, right, which have changed again, not for the vast majority of people on planet Earth, but for some people on planet Earth. Like again, talking about the quote-unquote first world countries. Anyway. The year of revolutions throughout Europe, the year in which Marx and Engels published the Manifesto of the Communist Party, the fateful year of 1848. And again, as I mentioned elsewhere, I feel that quite legitimately it may be thought that the collapse of Europe was sealed in 1848. That basically there's a direct line of progression from the failure of revolutions in 1848 and the First World War, and then therefore the Second World War in 1914 and in 1939, right? Anyway, this is to some extent my own personal opinion. I don't want you to take it too seriously, but I think it's something to consider. Anyway, so it's like socialism or barbarism. And Europe in 1848 chose barbarism. What barbarism? Barbarism of the appalling death and destruction of the First and the Second World War, right? As a result of his radical activism, he was so. You know what? Let me write this, right. Socialism or barbarism, 1914, 1945. Anyway, as a result of his radical activism, Marx was forced to leave Germany for France, moving to Belgium, then finally London, where he settled until his death. So, let me go back to this. 1914, 1945, right? So, how do you call it? Gemeinsames Untergang der kämpfenden Klassen, right? So this notion that the class struggle ends with the victory of the progressive class, or with the common ruin of the contending classes. In many ways, 1914 to 1945 is the common ruin of the contending classes, maybe. And the question in 2021, what about 2021? Where are we moving from here? We have challenges now that the world did not face 100 years ago. Anyway, in London, Marx began work on Critique of Political Economy, first volume known as Das Kapital. So notice, Critique of Political Economy is in many ways a criticism of liberal economics, right? It is a criticism of liberal economics. So specifically, Adam Smith says that capitalism produces universal opulence, universal let's say wealth for all, and Marx disagrees. He says, no, under capitalism, rich get richer and poor get poorer. Okay, polarization. This is in many ways the biggest idea of Das Kapital, if you want. Anyway, this great work took many decades and was never published as a complete work in his lifetime, Das Kapital. The subsequent volumes were published after Marx's death under the auspices of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So again, the bulk of the important writings of Marx were really published way after the Russian Revolution. So to what extent is Marx really responsible for Russian Revolution? I want to say not very much, but that's a separate point. Anyway, throughout this period of writing this great work, Marx and Engels also authored a lengthy stream of short works, pamphlets, and journalism. Marx died in 1883 and is buried in Highgate Cemetery, London. Within 4 decades of his death, Marx's influence was to be felt as a world historical force through Russian Revolution. And in many ways, I think it's, as far as I can tell, it is the Russian Revolution that made Marx truly famous. Anyway, but be that as it may. Yet, Marx has always thought the world proletarian revolution would begin in one of the advanced capitalist countries such as Germany, Britain, or the United States, not in a relatively backward country, backward peasant feudal country such as Russia. Marx's reputation, where basically slavery was abolished in 1861, I think, Marx's reputation and philosophy had subsequently been tarnished by association with the history and legacy of the communist rule in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Yet, it remains questionable how much of the blame for the history of Soviet Union should be laid at the feet of Marx. I talked about this. Important words, right? In this chapter, we'll try to leave aside his legacy and focus on his ideas, which is what we should do, I feel, as well. And in particular, the implications of his materialist theory of history for the understanding of the state and modern politics. Okay. Marx transforms previous attempt at political philosophy by rejecting what he calls their idealism and turns instead to materialist theory of history. Why does he do this? And why does he place the analysis of capitalism at the center of his theory? To answer these questions and to make sense of Marx's distinctive theory, we need to step back and consider his rejections of Hegel philosophy, and in particular, Hegel's theory of history. Okay, so this was the introductory part. I said a bunch of things. Maybe let me pause here and we'll continue in a bit. Okay, so continuing on from where we left off. So, section 2, analyzing capitalism. Marx transforms previous attempts at political philosophy by rejecting what he calls their idealism and turns instead to a materialist theory of history. So these words, idealism, materialism, are fairly complicated, but some attempt at understanding what they mean. Anyway, why does he do this, and why does he place the analysis of capitalism at the center of his theory? Right? To answer these questions and to make sense of Marx's distinctive theory, we need to step back and consider his rejections of Hegel's philosophy, and in particular, Hegel's theory of history. Hegel explains the process of coming. So this is important, interesting. This is a recap of Hegel. Hegel explains the process of coming to self-knowledge as a dialectical process in history, where mind comes to self-consciousness through a process of alienation of the self and a return to self-consciousness. As we saw, this is a very complex idea to grasp, but put simply, it means that man's quest for understanding begins with a confrontation of his strangeness or alien character of the world of which he is a part. This quest for understanding, so again, very importantly, right? So if Marx famously says that the point is not to interpret the world, but to change it, right? It's as if Hegel is saying, no, the point is not to change the world, but to interpret it in such a way that it does not need changing. Anyway, this quest for understanding posits a conception of human nature as distinct from the rest of nature, but in turn, this new posit itself becomes alien or strange and must be overcome. Hegel uses this process of alienation and its overcoming to explain the idea of Geist, or collective mind, coming to self-consciousness. This, he suggests, is what lies beneath the truth of religion as God's attempt to reveal himself in creation. Again, so complicated. Again, story. Should we interpret Hegel as a straightforward Christian, or should we take this as some sort of a metaphor? Still, anyway. Truth of religion as God's attempt to reveal himself in creation, which then, through sin, becomes alienated and must be reconciled to him through his action in the world or his revelation. We find our freedom when we understand our natures as part of this collective communitarian process. So the word communitarian now in respect to Hegel. Anyway, this overtly Christian theological dimension to Hegel's theory is taken up and transformed by Ludwig Feuerbach. So Ludwig Feuerbach is going to criticize Hegel, a near contemporary of Marx. Feuerbach turns Hegel's conception of dialectic of self-consciousness on its head. He argues that it is only man who is seeking to overcome alienation by overcoming the idea of God, who is merely a projection of man's aspirations and highest qualities. So again, it's not God who makes man, but men who make God. So people invent the idea of God and then alienate all that is good among themselves, among us, good belonging to us, our highest aspirations and highest qualities. We alienate them onto this invented picture of God. And so to overcome alienation is to overcome the idea of God and to understand that it's not that God is good and man is base, but no, in some sense that we are God, right? So this humanistic inversion of religion. Anyway, these then become a source of tyranny over him. So the religious ideas become a source of tyranny over men through the way in which man organizes religion, in which organized religion uses the human projection of God to coerce mankind. Organized religion uses the human projection of God to coerce mankind. So again, there's no simple way around this. I think doing serious political philosophy forces us to confront some problematic views of religion, including entertain views which are very critical of religion. Some, it's hard to phrase this in calm, careful language, but again, I feel that this is one of those problematic real-world issues that we have to confront in this course. Anyway, Feuerbach's critique of Hegel is to reject the idea of history as the story of God or mind revealing himself to himself through his creation, but instead of man revealing himself to himself. So again, so the history does not reveal God to man, but reveals man to man. Right? It's us that we find as the goal of human history, if you want. To overcome his alienation, man must overcome religion and the idea of a transcendent God. Again, so we have this very important notion in Marx as well, that critique of ideology begins with critique of religion. Although Marx ultimately, contrary to Hegel, is going to say that religion is only a symptom, not a real cause. Anyway, overcoming freedom and alienation involves overcoming religion. Overcoming alienation. I'm not sure what the word freedom is doing here. Overcoming alienation involves overcoming religion. I'm not sure what the word freedom. Anyway, Marx is potentially sympathetic to Feuerbach's critique of Hegel, but he claims it does not go far enough. So Feuerbach does not go far enough. Feuerbach replaces religion with humanism, but remains idealist. Feuerbach replaces religion with humanism, but remains idealist. For Marx, Feuerbach has not explained why mankind projects itself into the external idea of God. Feuerbach has not explained human alienation, but merely described it as a projection. Where should we look for an explanation? Marx's answer is to urge us to shift paradigms or perspectives in order to explain what Feuerbach is talking about. Drawing on his experience as a radical journalist of the extreme poverty and working conditions of the new industrial working class, Marx provides a materialist reading of history. It is appalling material conditions that cause man to feel alienated from himself and to project the idea of God as a desperate attempt to make sense of these conditions. So the religion is not a cause. Religion is not a cause, but merely a symptom of human suffering and human powerlessness. Again, religion is the opium of the people. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, the soul of the soulless condition, right? So it is material conditions that cause us to understand ourselves and the world in a certain way, not thought that determines material conditions. So material conditions determine thought, not the other way around. Marx rejects the idea that the world is a world of ideas by claiming that ideas are a reflection of material conditions. Ideas are a reflection of material conditions. For this reason, Marx turns to economics. Once it is clear that material conditions are the key to history and self-consciousness, then it is equally clear to Marx that an understanding of those material conditions is central to making sense of historical change. Political thought and ideas will always be subservient to material conditions. Henceforth, Marx turns to the analysis of those material conditions in their most sophisticated form, namely the capitalist mode of production. So the most sophisticated form of material conditions, right? Anyway, Marx's analysis of capitalism, like Hegel's theory of history, is enormously complex and subtle, and therefore easy to caricature. Easy to caricature and hard to portray without caricaturing, right? That said, for our purposes, we can identify a number of central elements in his analysis of capitalism. Capitalism is a unique mode of production distinct from other modes, such as feudalism, for example, which preceded it. Modes of production are complex social systems that relate the forces of production and relations of production. So forces of production and relations of production. The concept of forces of production refers to the level of technology prevalent in a particular mode of production. Feudalism is characterized by small hand-operated machines such as spinning wheels, whereas capitalism is characterized by mechanized production, steam and electric power, and the knowledge and skills associated with it. By the way, at some point, we definitely should do like a table of comparison between feudalism, capitalism, and communism. I think this would be very useful. I have some ideas on how to do this exactly. Anyway, so I owe you back to the text. Yeah, so knowledge and skills associated with it. So notice knowledge and skills would be part of forces of production. So in this sense, knowledge and skills are thought by Marx to be part of the material base. Right, so the material base is actually, at the end of the day, not that material, or at least material in a different sense from the usual meaning of the word material. Anyway, the level and type of technology is absolutely crucial for Marx because it is the level of technology that determines everything else. Well, determines is a strong word. Was Marx really an economic determinist? That's a complicated issue. Anyway, the next dimension is the relations of production. This concept refers to the social relations that follow from the form of technology being deployed. Marx's central insight is that the relations between people in a world of handlooms will differ from those in the world of steam power. In the latter, large numbers of workers can be employed under the direction of a single individual. So when we talk about relations of production, we're first and foremost talk about relations of domination and wage slavery, if you want. Slavery has a technical meaning for Marx, but the word wage slavery, I think, captures something important. Anyway, the relations of production also include such issues as who owns and directs production, all of which have bearing on the nature of the mode of production. So who owns the surplus? Who controls the surplus? This is very important. Surplus. Taken together, the forces of production, relations of production form the economic base of society and in turn shape everything else. But no society consists only of factories, farms, or workshops. There will also be a superstructure, so an economic base and an ideological superstructure that grows up to support and sustain the mode of production. The superstructure will include such things as the legal system and the set of rights it contains, the institutions of political rule and government, as well as culture, art, philosophy, ideology, and religion. So all of these wonderful things. And morality, right? So morality is also superstructural, which is a problem, right? Does Marx have a moral critique of capitalism? Well, if morality is superstructural, Marx cannot really have a moral critique of capitalism, it seems. Anyway, all these things will be determined by or reflect the economic base, the level of technology and relations of production, and are ultimately at the service of the productive forces and relations of production. So again, legal system, political rule, government, culture, art, philosophy, ideology, religion, at the service of the mode of production, right? Basically, at the service of the capitalist class, to oversimplify. All political theories are at the service of productive forces and relations of production that make up the mode of production. This is why Marx thinks that simply rejecting religion will not free us from alienation. Simply rejecting religion will not free us from alienation. Religion is not a cause, it's a symptom. As the forces that sustain religion will merely appear in some other ideology. Very interesting, right? So you can talk about Soviet ideology, right? Soviet Union is not communist. In fact, Marx is very well posited to explain the ideology of the Soviet Union, and especially the quasi-religious ideology of the Soviet Union. Anyway, an important point, but let's continue. In criticizing Feuerbach, Marx famously claims that all previous philosophers have sought to understand the world. The task is to change it. So in many ways, we're inverting Hegel on his head. So analyzing the material conditions of a mode of production is not the only thing that Marx is concerned with. After all, one could accept his account of capitalism without claiming that there's anything wrong with it. Okay, so wrong, interesting questions. If Marx rejects moral critique, how can he say that capitalism is wrong, right? Marx rejects the idea of a simple moral critique of capitalism, yet he sees material conditions as the key to human alienation and the primary obstacle to emancipation. So alienation and emancipation, judgmental terms. In order to make sense of Marx's attitude to capitalism, we need to understand not only its structure and organization, but also its internal logic. Again, I would say that at the end of the day, my reading of Marx is immanent critique, right? So this idea that capitalism is internally contradictory, and that's the problem with capitalism, and it has nothing to do with your morality or your stance, right? So capitalism has within itself certain tensions, certain contradictions that exploitation, right? That people who produce the surplus are not the ones who control the surplus, and there has to be deception and force in order to keep the system stable and keep the system going. And this would be immanent critique, right? So we're pointing to internal instability, not just using judgmental language. Okay. Activity. List 3 features of the forces of production and 3 features of the relations of production of the capitalist and feudalist mode of production. Clue. Some may have been mentioned above. Interesting activity. Again, I think it's very, very fruitful. Again, at some point, definitely we need to do a summary, a table comparing feudalism to capitalism to communism. I think there are important conclusions to be drawn from that. Okay. Okay, maybe again we could pause here. Okay, continuing on. So criticizing capitalism, alienation and exploitation. Marx's attitude to capitalism is ambivalent and easy to caricature. Ambivalent. So capitalism is both good and bad. On the one hand, he sees capitalism as the latest stage of historical development and as a sign of the enormous transformative power of technology. As a part of a historical process, it's not something people can choose to make, nor is it something that we can just wish away, right? Yet, Marx is not merely fatalistic in the face of productive forces of capitalism. His analysis of the structure and logic of capitalism also uncovers the enormous suffering and destruction that capitalism brings. I like to phrase this less in terms of suffering and destruction and more in terms of internal contradictions, internal tensions. Yet Marx's point is not only to complain about the evils of capitalism or provide moral judgment on capitalism. After all, the problem is not that capitalists are nasty people and proletarians are good people. Engels was a capitalist and a good friend and a benefactor of Marx and his family. The real issue is not a question of morality, but of the structural relations of power that create conflict and struggle. Structural problems require structural solutions. One of Marx's criticisms of previous political philosophies is that they make crude moral judgments that are free from a basis in the correct understanding of material conditions. This is why Marx is so hostile to utopian visions of socialism. Marx's aim is to base his critique of capitalism in a correct understanding of its workings. He does this by identifying alienation and exploitation as necessary features of the logic of capitalism. One cannot have one without the other. Okay, alienation. Alienation is a concept that Marx borrows from Hegel, but he uses it in a different way. One of Marx's claims is that capitalism alienates mankind from its species being. Complicated phrase. Species being is a peculiar concept that looks a lot like a theory of human nature. So species being looks a lot like a theory of human nature, an account of what mankind really is like. However, Marx cannot really have a theory of human nature because of his historical materialism, because there's no one set human nature. Human nature is evolving, right? As we have seen above, any concept of man's nature, even Marx continues to think of mankind as male, okay, maybe. So anyway, any concept of man's nature will be shaped by the prevailing relations of production that hold in the relevant mode of production. So human nature is historically changing, right? Slave societies, feudalism, capitalism all have different conceptions of human nature, different historical conceptions of human nature. Marx is alluding to the minimal material conditions that underlie all historical conceptions of human nature. Minimal material conditions that underlie all historical conceptions of human nature, right? So the basic premise of all history is that human beings have to be alive, have to eat and have shelter, clothing, that kind of thing. What Marx means is that mankind is distinguished from other natural creatures in a sense that it can labor to produce its material needs and to create its nature. So through labor, we can reshape our own nature. Man is an animal who labors, but in laboring, man creates the conditions of his own identity and needs, and the circumstances of his fulfillment. By laboring, we can transform and control nature and turn it to purposes that we acquire through labor. So through labor, we acquire even new needs, and communism is not going back, it's going forward. People are going to have more needs under capitalism, and we'll be able to satisfy them even more than they do under capitalism. It's not a moving backward. Anyway, but in doing so, Marx argues we are unwittingly creating structures that impose new forms of domination and control over us. And this leads to alienation. To see what Marx means, think back to Locke's argument about property acquisition. In order to preserve ourselves and realize our goals, we must labor and transform nature to our ends. In the first instance, we find accumulation of property as one way of transforming the world. Eventually, however, all the property in land is accumulated, but because of the invention of money, subsequent generations are able to secure their subsistence by goals by selling their labor for wages. But for Marx, the wage system imposes its own tyranny on laborers by forcing them to do that which will pay enough to secure their subsistence on terms that are decided by the owners of the capital, right? So effectively wage slavery, right? So capitalism is a continuation of feudalism by other means. We still see the force, right? People forced to sell their labor on the pain of starvation, which is very much true of the at least 7 billion people on planet Earth in 2021. Anyway, if the capitalist does not need labor, then labor has nothing to sell. If the capitalist does need labor, then capitalists can purchase it and therefore direct the life of the laborer towards the ends that are really not his own. Again, economic relations as relations of power. This is important. Economic relations as relations of power. Something that many of you maybe will experience in their lives. Anyway, the capitalist fixes the terms of the labor contract and will seek to maximize the amount of labor power for the minimum return. Finally, the laborer is employed in the capitalist system as a servant of the machines he operates, and it is the machines that become most important because labor is easily replaceable as a result of the low skill created by the division of labor. So division of labor, very important in this sense. Again, de-skilling of the workers, replaceability of the workers, also the technological progress which creates the reserve army of the unemployed. Anyway, the point Marx makes is that laboring, which should be the most complete expression of fulfillment of our species being, becomes something outside of our control, which tyrannizes over us, which ultimately decides whether we live or die. So labor, instead of being the expression of human nature, turns into fetters, chains on human nature, if you want. Exploitation. Along with the charge of alienation, Marx also claims that wage labor system at the heart of capitalism is fundamentally exploitative. Marx makes 2 points here. First is the analytical point about how capitalism works. Capitalist is only able to function because he exploits the laborer by extracting surplus value from the labor power of his workers. Surplus value is the difference in value between what the laborer creates through the exercise of his labor power and what the capitalist must pay in order to acquire his labor power. As the capitalist controls the access to the opportunity to labor and therefore the ability to earn wages, he can set the terms of the labor contract. However, the capitalist is not merely a mean-spirited individual, trying to drive down the cost. Instead, he must exploit his workers by exploiting surplus value in order to purchase and service the machines that labor depends upon. Surplus value is the key to capitalism, yet although it is created by labor, it is controlled by the capitalist. So a lot of things going on here. I'm not sure how much we want to explain this. Again, the basic idea is that technological progress creates the reserve army of the unemployed. Labor is de-skilled in this conveyor belt production. So the wage is driven down to some low value, maybe the subsistence value. And the difference between the productivity of the worker and the amount that it costs to reproduce the worker is basically exploitation. The worker is more productive than the food, than the 2,000 calories that the worker eats. I'm simplifying a little bit. But on the other hand, again, the study guide doesn't talk about this here, but again, we have the coercive laws of competition in the market. The capitalist must exploit the worker, otherwise the capitalist goes bankrupt and becomes worker themselves. And this does not really help anyone. Right? Anyway, so this brings us to the second, so we have 2 points here. The first is the analytical point, and the second is, the second point, we'll see what the second point is. So the second point In contrast to Hegel's view of modernity as the extension of human freedom through the idea of citizen and modern state, Marx claims that modernity represents the ever more perfect expansion of exploitation and coercion. So in this sense, capitalism is the most exploitative system ever. It's the most dehumanizing system ever. Feudalism, in this sense, had some vestiges of humanity, which capitalism loses anyway. This is not merely a rhetorical ploy, but has implications for the scope of traditional political theory. As we have seen, all the theories so far considered have made claims about the scope and limits of freedom that is compatible with self-rule, legitimacy, and security. But for Marx, all these theoretical views of freedom are misleading, as all social relations in capitalist modernity are based upon material exploitation. Right? The relations of production in capitalist society reflect the exploitation at its heart, and therefore freedom cannot be achieved by political or legal reform, because politics, law, and even religion are premised on exploitation. Yes. Yes, yes. We are nearing the end. Class struggle and revolution. One of the most important concepts in Marx's thought, which has yet to be mentioned, is class. Class and class struggle are the two most widely known features of Marx's account of politics and historical change. As we have seen, the relations of production in capitalist society comprise the most extensive exploitation known to history, as the majority of people are drawn into wage labor system as industrialization expands. These exploitative relations of production are relations between social classes. For Marx, class is more important than the individual because it is the class position that determines the nature of the individuals. Class is more important than the individual because it is the class position that determines the nature of individuals. Right? One needs to remember that class position is not something that individuals adopt or choose freely, right? Nor is it just concerned with culture or manners as someone speaks about, upper class or lower class. Instead, class identity and position is determined by the role one plays in the productive process. So it's economically determined. Owners of capital are in one class, and their membership in that class is determined by their economic function, whereas laborers are in another class determined by their position as wage laborers. Class is an identity imposed upon us by mode of production. But class membership does not determine everything in a simplistic way. Capitalists such as Engels, for example, could side with the proletariat as the progressive force in history, but in his role as a capitalist, he still represents an interest that is contrary to the proletariat. What this suggests is that although much of the conflict between workers and bosses in the 19th century took a very personal form, the heartless exploiters versus the noble worker, Marx does not repeat the view of the 19th century novelists who argued that this would be better if only workers and bosses could get together. Okay, so Marx is very much against this. So this is again not a moral critique of capitalism, but exploitation is a structural problem, requires a structural solution. The problem with such views is that they are utopian. Capital and labor are two mutually incompatible interests because of their role in the fundamentally exploitative productive process. They represent two conflicting economic interests, and it is this clash of interests that shapes politics and the state. No individual, however noble and just, can overcome this fundamental clash of interest. Instead, history must overcome this dialectical contradiction by overcoming capitalism itself. Marx's commitment. So, by the way, I keep talking about how, maybe Switzerland is already 30 or maybe 50% communist. Well, it cannot be communist all the way because so long as exploitation persists, so long as capitalism persists, workers may get some concessions, but we will not overcome capitalism without overcoming capitalism. It's a bit of a tautology. Anyway. Marx's commitment to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. So when we say revolutionary, I don't think, not necessarily, the revolution doesn't have to be bloody. Not necessarily. It probably will be bloody, but it doesn't necessarily have to be bloody. Overthrow of capitalism is in fact his recognition that the conflict of interest between labor and capital cannot be removed by consensus, but must be overcome by overcoming the material conditions that give rise to class conflict in the first instance. But as capitalism involves the greatest extent of exploitation through the wage labor system, the overcoming of capitalism does not merely usher a new mode of production, as happens with the move from feudalism to capitalism. Instead, the overthrow of capitalism is important because it involves the overthrow of exploitation itself. Bold words, bold statements. And it is only once this has been achieved that mankind can begin to experience real freedom. For the first time, the end of human prehistory and the beginning of human history. The mechanism for the overthrow of capitalism is found in the exploitative relations of production at the heart of mode of production. Is it for this reason that Marx considers the eventual revolutionary overthrow of capitalism as a part of his own internal logic? How does this process work? Okay. Marx argues that the process of exploitation that provides the dynamic of capitalism has the effect of progressively impoverishing the workers. So rich become richer, poor become poorer. This is because the capitalists need to continue to extract the surplus value despite the progressive decline in the rate of profit. Tendency towards the decline of the rate of profit. Again, interesting technical problem in Marxian economics. I don't necessarily want to talk about this now, but first-class honors, make a note. It's a complicated issue. Anyway, profits must decline as a result of competition among capitalists and the increasing deployment of technology by capitalist producers, and most importantly, the impoverishment of workers who will be the primary market for the produced goods. Right. And therefore we get the crisis of overproduction. Capitalism is caught in a contradiction because of the need to exploit labor in order to sustain the productive process. In the long run, this tendency, the tendency of capitalist economies is to reduce the return on labor by forcing down wages. As we have seen, this affects both the laborer in terms of the progressive impoverishment and the capitalist in terms of the declining markets and increasing competition for market share. So we're moving towards the economic crisis. Something that most of us probably can relate to, right? Anyway, the inevitable crisis tendency within capitalism can be deferred for a time by using advanced technology or by seeking control over new markets. Later Marxist theorists made much of colonialism and imperialism in the early 20th century as an attempt by capitalist society to postpone the inevitable crisis. Interesting, right? However, the inherent historical contradictions within capitalism are unavoidable. For Marx, you can postpone but cannot avoid. For Marx, there must come a point where the increased deployment of technology and the reduction in wage rates means that unemployment and below subsistence level wage rates, so this is very important, so unemployment and below subsistence wage rates are necessary. And once their labor no longer guarantees subsistence for all the proletariat, then the conflict of interest between the workers sustaining themselves and the capitalists trying to sustain themselves will result in a revolutionary change, ushering a new communist order. Again, workers on the pain of hunger, through below subsistence wages, forcing to unionize and forcing to make revolution. Again, this is materialist theory of social change. Revolution happens because we are forced by material forces of production to change it. Anyway, remember that for Marx, this process is inevitable because of the nature of capitalism. Well, inevitable, with a question mark, especially in later volumes of Das Kapital. Furthermore, the true revolution will only occur when the whole proletariat class is forced into extreme impoverishment. So what about Gramsci? What about concessions? Gramsci, concessions. What about Lenin? The bourgeoisification of the proletariat. Of the proletariat in the first world countries. Interesting, problematic questions. Hard to answer. Problems to keep in mind. Anyway, what will the revolution look like? Although subsequent Marxist revolutionaries have written a lot about the conduct of revolution and the role of violence, Marx says very little in his main theoretical works. So Marx doesn't really lay out any kind of detailed plan of how this is supposed to work. Once again, he saw his task as explaining the process by which capitalism will collapse, not one of predicting its time and place or the precise strategies that should be employed by revolutionaries. Important. Whereas Marx does write about revolutionary politics, it is usually in the negative sense of criticizing socialist traditions such as anarchism that try to initiate and direct revolution, or else utopian socialism, which tries to overcome the class conflict through reform of capitalist economy. What happens next? Question mark. Let's look at activities. Do you think that subsequent history has disproven Marx's view of the inevitable collapse of capitalism? Give 2 reasons why he might be right and 2 reasons why he might be wrong. Again, Classical University of London. Yes and no, always yes and no. Find out about either Russian or the Chinese Communist Revolution. Do either of these fit the account of Marxist Communist Revolution? Interesting questions. Yes. Anyway, deep breath. Last section. Communism. Marx's best-known work is the Communist Manifesto, and the subsequent history of communist revolution in the 20th century has its roots in Marx's ideas. But what does Marx mean by communism? Communism is the next stage in the historical process following the overthrow of capitalism. But what is communism like? Once again, Marx is extremely reticent about specifying the nature of communism. Marx does not say, he doesn't say, unlike the utopian socialists, Marx wants to assert his scientific credential by identifying tendencies in history. So identifying real tendencies that exist today, rather than engaging in clairvoyant predictions about the precise nature of communism. Marx says, you know, communism is going to be a future free society. How can you predict what they're going to be like, right? You can only identify tendencies in the present, like the self-destructive tendency which is inherent in capitalism. Anyway, what does Marx say? What Marx says about communism is very brief and sketchy. So there's nothing like a very precise description of what communism should be like. Yet we can identify a number of features that the communist society must follow, right? From the way in which it overcomes the contradictions of capitalism. Anyway, the move from capitalism to communism is not abrupt, but is rather a process involving a passage through a socialist phase, characterized as the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, maybe, yes. Dictatorship, again, dictatorship in the Latin sense of the word, as temporary emergency powers. Temporary emergency powers, right? What Marx seems to mean by this is not that proletariat will be dictated by a vanguard party, as in Leninism, but rather the dictatorship of the proletariat is a dictatorship of and by each member of the proletariat. So it's not really a dictatorship at all in the conventional sense, but rather like Rousseau's idea of political rule under the general will, where everyone rules everyone else. Something like direct democracy. Marx never uses the word democracy because for him, democracy is, in the words of later Marxists, capitalist parliamentarianism, right? So, but communism is the true democracy. Anyway, this is necessary in order to overcome the idea of domination and oppression that marked all previous class politics. So the dictatorship of the proletariat ushers in communism by replacing the idea of domination of one class by another, and therefore the possibility of exploitation. Unlike all previous revolutions, the communist revolution cannot simply replace the domination of one class by that of a new class, because in the process of doing so, it places a class in the position of dominator, but with no one to dominate or to exploit but itself. So again, it's the idea of a direct democracy. If everybody truly takes part in ruling, then there's cannot be an exploited class, right? The revolution of the proletariat is the most exploited, class. So there's no one else to dominate. Is this good logic? Well, difficult questions. Is this watertight logic? I would say maybe not exactly. Some questions you can ask about this. Anyway, but let's continue. But to believe the story is to believe in democracy, I believe. Like if you believe that democracy is possible, then you should at least say that what Marx is talking about is plausible on some level. Anyway, from John Stuart Mill to Jürgen Habermas, I feel that we are laying the groundwork for what communist society may look like actually. Anyway, this fact has the advantage of eradicating domination and exploitation, for if everyone is both dominator and dominated, exploiter and exploited, both categories cease to mean anything. Okay, so maybe. Complicated issues. So the communist revolution marks the end of history, at least in the sense of history as the history of exploitation. So actually the end of human prehistory and the beginning of human history in the proper sense of the word, the realm of freedom, which lies beyond the realm of necessity. The next point about communist society is related to the overcoming of exploitation. Marx saw the root of capitalist exploitation in the wage labor system, so overcoming exploitation must entail overcoming the wage labor system and the idea of private property that underlies it. So private property, of course, we talk about private control of the means of production. Private control of means of production, which again should be seen as, having implications for political power compared to feudalism, compared to feudal privileges. I feel that many of us can see the analogy between the two, between the capitalist private property, the status of the billionaires, and the status of feudal lords. Again, capitalism is a continuation of feudalism by other means, way more efficient means, but still. Anyway, Marx describes the next stage of history after capitalism as communism because he believes that it must be a society without either private property on the means of production or money. Yeah, problematic issues. Some later Marxists will say, well, maybe you can have money in communism. Who knows? It's a complicated story. Anyway, whatever else happens in communist society, it will be a society without ownership of the means of production, I would say, anyway, because you still own your toothbrush and you probably your car and probably your flat as well. Anyway, one of the attractions of this for Marx is that labor will cease to be a necessity imposed from outside, either by nature, hunger, or coercion by capitalists, but will return to being human need and expression of freedom and identity. Right? Labor as expression of human freedom and identity. For Marx, freedom is only possible once tyranny of production is removed. Freedom is only possible once the tyranny of production is removed. But how does this happen? Marx's theory becomes most opaque here. Marx does not say. On the one level, he suggests, I would say, voluntary division of labor, basically, right? On the one level, he suggests, and it's no stronger than that, right, that the enormous productive potential of technology, robots, right? Marx doesn't write about them, but he writes about the enormous productive potential of technology, will continue to grow, and therefore abundance will be achieved. By this, Marx means that everyone can have all that they want, from each according to his ability to each according to their need. In this way, man is freed from the tyranny of nature. Yes, yet Marx does not suggest that we will simply become Hobbesian men, does not suggest that we will simply become Hobbesian men, seeking desire after desire, ceasing only in death, but without the constraint of scarcity. Instead, Marx suggests that we will be transformed by overcoming the tyranny of need. Freed from the tyranny of competition, we become new and potentially unrecognizable individuals. So much so that Marx thinks it is that very little is served by trying to describe or prescribe what life would be like. So again, communism is a free society, so it's difficult to imagine what life will be like. Again, this overcoming of scarcity, overcoming of ownership, overcoming of wage labor. This is not Soviet Russia. This is not Soviet China, okay? You don't really have, again, you know what my examples are. I don't want to reiterate them here. Whatever life is like, it will be free from exploitation and alienation. All this seems very far removed from the idea of the modern state and the need to determine the scope and limits of its authority. Yet this is precisely the challenge Marx leaves us. Should we see the claim of political thought simply as ideas in the service of a ruling class and diversions from the real forces driving history? Mm-hmm. Many subsequent political scientists have drawn this lesson from Marx and focused instead on the analysis and explanation of politics that plays down the role of ideas and ignores the claims of morality. This is so even among those who reject Marx's critique of capitalism, yet others still feel dissatisfied with Marx's rejections of agency and individuality here and now, and feel that his offer of freedom and overcoming of exploitation in the future is no more satisfying than the medieval religious theories of politics that offered the poor a better life in the next world. Okay, harsh words, right? So not freedom and struggle in the here and now, but somewhere in the communist future. Communism now, right? Perhaps in the meantime, we still need to address the issues of individual right and state power, even if, as the great economist John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we are all dead. Okay. And a short reminder of your learning outcomes. Having completed this chapter and the essential reading and activities, you should be able to explain Marx's critique of wage labor, explain the main features of his theory of historical change, analyze the process of transition from capitalism to communism, describe the role of politics and the state in his ideas. Have we explained all of this? No, we barely scratched the surface, but at least something. Sample examination questions. Does Marx offer a moral critique of capitalism? Mostly no, but maybe yes to some extent. Is the collapse of capitalism inevitable according to Marx? In the study guide, clearly yes, but in fact, if you read in the secondary literature, not exactly. Does Marx have a theory of human nature? Well, on the one level, yes, but on the other hand, human nature changes with the modes of production. Human nature is historically relative, right? And who knows what's going to happen under communism? So as always, the answer to all of the University of London questions is yes and no. Okay, colleagues, I hope this is going to be useful or at least stimulating. So, without further ado, stay safe, take care, and I'll see you around.